The world today is passing through one of the most uncertain and complicated phases in modern political history. Long-standing alliances are being tested, trade partnerships are facing new pressures, and the stability that once defined global cooperation is being challenged. Much of this tension is tied to the policies and actions of Donald Trump, whose approach to international trade and diplomacy has disrupted many traditional norms. Economic tariffs have increasingly become tools of political influence. Financial pressure is now commonly used in negotiations, and countries that once worked comfortably as allies are sometimes being treated more like competitors. This environment has created a sense of unpredictability in global markets and diplomatic circles alike. Yet while these tensions continue to shape international politics, one leader has adopted a noticeably different strategy. Instead of responding with confrontation or threats, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney has focused on building cooperation and strengthening relationships with partners around the world. Rather than amplifying disputes, Carney has concentrated on expanding alliances, reinforcing diplomatic ties, and demonstrating how leadership can function effectively during a period marked by global uncertainty. His approach is drawing increasing attention from analysts who see it as a model of steady leadership during the turbulent political era associated with Donald Trump. For audiences following these developments through Trade Insight, the contrast between these two leadership styles has become one of the most fascinating geopolitical narratives of the moment.
Yeah, I don't think there's really much of an option at this point. I think it's a bit of a reminder that the job of prime minister at this point, and maybe going forward, is increasingly international. And you can't sort of treat foreign affairs and visits to other countries as sort of a secondary concern.
To understand why Mark Carney's actions are attracting global attention, it is important to first examine the environment in which he is operating. The international system that guided diplomacy and trade for decades is currently facing enormous pressure. For many years, nations such as Canada relied on dependable relationships with allied countries. Trade agreements were relatively stable, diplomatic cooperation was consistent, and governments could plan long-term economic strategies with confidence that international partnerships would remain predictable. However, the situation changed significantly when Donald Trump introduced a more aggressive economic strategy. Under his leadership, tariffs became a primary negotiating instrument. Allied nations were sometimes warned of financial consequences, and commercial relationships that had once seemed permanent suddenly faced uncertainty. Many observers now describe the global economy as entering a period of turbulence. Markets continue to operate, but the reliability that once defined international trade has weakened. Governments must now make strategic decisions in a far more unpredictable environment. This new reality has forced countries like Canada to rethink their position in the global system. When one key partner becomes less predictable, the logical response is diversification. Nations must seek additional partnerships, expand access to new markets, and strengthen connections with a broader range of allies.
Right. I'll start with you, Rob. What did you make of the Prime Minister's handling of this? In this initial written statement saying that they supported the U.S. trying to get rid of nuclear capabilities in Iran, and then spending really days trying to make sure that people understood where he really stood on the issue.
I think it reflects the reality of where we are in Canada today, that economic typhoons are unleashed in Canada because of the twitch muscles of Donald Trump. So when a statement like that is crafted, it's crafted really, it was in this instance, for an audience of one, and that was Donald Trump. And we've seen that in the recent past. I was with the Prime Minister on his last trip abroad when this whole notion of the Board of Peace came up. And Mr. Carney, the Prime Minister, initially said that, yes, he would take part in the Board of Peace. And then he actually had a little chance to look at it, gauge the reaction to it, and had to withdraw as elegantly as he could. And it wasn't easy to do that with very much dignity. That statement that you read, that initial statement, said that Canada supported the U.S. in its objective of trying to make Iran a non-nuclear state.
Yeah.
Well, when you say you support the U.S. these days, what you're saying is you're putting your trust in Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth. And that's a difficult place to be, particularly when you don't have an audience of one. You've got a liberal caucus, you've got a domestic audience that does not want to be associated with Donald Trump. And I think what followed after that statement was a result of people putting that calculation into the machine.
That is precisely the path Mark Carney has chosen. Instead of reacting emotionally to political pressure or escalating confrontations, he has focused on reinforcing Canada's long-term international position through strategic diplomacy. In recent days alone, Carney traveled throughout the Indo-Pacific region, meeting leaders in India, Australia, and Japan. These visits were not simply symbolic diplomatic events designed to produce headlines or photographs. Each meeting was centered on real economic cooperation that could significantly reshape Canada's global trade opportunities in the coming years. The discussions emphasized industries expected to shape the future international economy. Topics included energy exports, the development of critical minerals, the security of global supply chains, advanced technological innovation, and long-term investment collaboration. By focusing on these sectors, Carney is working to connect Canada with some of the most dynamic economic regions in the world. At the same time, he is positioning Canada as a dependable provider of resources and technology that modern industrial economies require. The strategy itself is straightforward but extremely powerful. The greater the number of partnerships Canada develops globally, the less susceptible it becomes to economic pressure from any single country. In a world where financial threats are often used as negotiating tools, expanding diplomatic and trade relationships becomes one of the most effective ways to protect national interests. This is where the contrast between Carney's approach and Trump's philosophy becomes particularly clear. Trump's strategy often depends on leverage. When the United States is a nation's dominant trading partner, Washington can apply tariffs, pressure industries, and demand concessions during negotiations. However, that influence only works if the other country has few alternatives. Carney's method moves in the opposite direction. Instead of accepting reliance on a single market, he is gradually reducing it. Instead of concentrating trade relationships in one region, he is broadening Canada's economic connections across multiple continents. This shift changes the balance of power. When Canada strengthens partnerships with countries such as India, Australia, and Japan, it gains something extremely valuable in international diplomacy: flexibility. In global politics, the nation with the most options usually holds the strongest negotiating position. Many analysts now believe the responsibilities of a prime minister have evolved significantly. Foreign policy can no longer be treated as a secondary issue. In today's interconnected world, leadership requires constant engagement with global partners, continuous development of trade networks, and careful maintenance of international relationships. That is exactly the strategy Mark Carney has been following. In a world shaped by uncertainty and rapid geopolitical changes, inactivity is not an option. Nations must actively create partnerships, secure new markets, strengthen alliances, and act quickly when opportunities appear.
It's the Prime Minister in Japan, where he wrapped up a 10-day trade tour with stops in India, Australia, and Japan, obviously. How effective were the Prime Minister's trade missions? It was a big, long trip, Aaron, and there appeared to be a lot of deals that were begun or signed about energy, trade, critical minerals. How important is it that the Prime Minister keep these trips up, even as Dominic LeBlanc is trying to get things back on the rails with the United States?
Yeah, I don't think there's really much of an option at this point. I think it's a bit of a reminder that the job of Prime Minister at this point, and maybe going forward, is increasingly international. And you can't sort of treat foreign affairs and visits to other countries as sort of a secondary concern. Obviously, the thing that always gets said coming out of these trips is, it remains to be seen what the things that were signed amount to and sort of what comes next. But I think that's sort of a long-term play. And, obviously a lot of what happened this week was overshadowed by Iran, understandably and for good reason. But I think this is really, an indication that this is kind of the way things have to work from now on, that the Prime Minister has to spend a lot of time abroad, has to spend a lot of time in capitals, both shoring up trade relationships, but also, shoring up relationships with allies. I think it was.
What makes Carney's strategy particularly notable is that it reflects a fundamentally different philosophy about how global leadership should operate. While Donald Trump has frequently used pressure, confrontation, and economic threats as negotiating tactics, Carney has concentrated on cooperation and strengthening alliances between democratic partners. This contrast in leadership style is becoming increasingly visible across the international stage. In a period marked by rising geopolitical tension and economic uncertainty, many governments are searching for dependable partners. Countries want relationships with leaders whose policies are consistent, whose diplomacy is stable, and whose actions promote cooperation instead of conflict. Under Mark Carney's leadership, Canada is increasingly stepping into that role. By expanding diplomatic ties throughout the Indo-Pacific, while maintaining strong relationships with traditional partners in Europe and North America, Canada is positioning itself as a nation capable of navigating geopolitical volatility without contributing to global instability. At a time when trust between nations is becoming more difficult to maintain, this approach is attracting significant attention from international observers. Diplomats and analysts are closely watching how Canada continues to develop this strategy. When historians eventually examine this period, they may describe it as a turning point in modern international politics, a time when the global system faced disruption and unpredictability, but also a moment when certain leaders chose a different course. Donald Trump chose disruption. Mark Carney chose diplomacy. Trump relied on pressure. Carney invested in partnerships. And while the global system continues to evolve, Canada appears determined not to fall behind these changes. Instead, under Carney's leadership, the country is working to help shape the next phase of international cooperation. For viewers following global developments through this channel, this evolving strategy offers a clear example of how modern diplomacy is adapting to a rapidly changing world. If you want thoughtful analysis of the major geopolitical developments shaping Canada and the wider global landscape, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next report. And now we would like to hear from you. Do you believe Mark Carney's diplomatic strategy is the right response to the pressure associated with Donald Trump's policies? Or should Canada adopt a stronger confrontational stance? Share your thoughts in the comments below.